The winter had grown quiet in a way only deep wilderness understands, the kind of quiet that held its breath as if afraid to break its own stillness. Snow lay in patient sheets across the open valley, smooth and untouched except for the winding trail that led to a lone cabin crouched at the edge of the pines. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin gray ribbon, wavering like an old memory unsure whether to stay or vanish. Inside that small cabin lived Susan Whitaker, 22 years old and carved by solitude in ways no one her age should ever be. She moved through the morning light with the softness of someone who had learned to speak more with silence than with words, her breath fogging faintly as she tugged on her worn boots and stepped outside into the cold. The air bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed it. Winter was the only companion she trusted now. For 3 long years since the fever took her family, it had stood beside her like an old sentinel guarding a wounded bird. She had grown used to the rhythm of it, the crisp mornings, the long gray afternoons, the nights that hummed with distant wolves. It no longer frightened her. Loneliness had its own shape, and she had learned to live inside it. She bent to gather firewood near the chopping stump, the logs stiff with frost. Her fingers, though gloved, shook slightly with the cold. She stacked them against her chest and looked toward the distant ridge. The sky there held a bruised tint, heavy with a storm yet to break. She studied the line where mountains met clouds, the way the world seemed to narrow into a single breath before snow fell. Sometimes she imagined her parents up in those mountains, whispering reminders that she was still part of something, even if she no longer knew what that was. Inside, the cabin greeted her with its familiar creaks, its stubborn door hinge, its humble warmth. She set the logs beside the hearth, fed one into the flame, and watched it catch. The fire danced with slow confidence, and she let her eyes linger on the shifting amber light. She often wondered if she still remembered how to be around people. Words felt foreign in her mouth. She talked mostly to the horses or to the wooden figurine her father carved, its little face softened by years of her thumb brushing across it. But the morning held a strange charge, an almost electric pull from beyond the tree line. She felt it as she stirred the coals, as she stepped back outside to check the traps near the creek. The forest seemed restless, the wind moving differently, not as a whisper but as a warning. She paused at the edge of the pines, her breath rising like pale smoke. The snow there bore no fresh tracks. Even the rabbits, bold in early winter, kept to their burrows today. When she returned to the cabin, she stopped suddenly. The horses, usually calm, stamped and snorted, ears pricked toward the west ridge. Their agitation tightened something inside her chest. She scanned the horizon. Nothing. Only endless white. Only endless silence. She tried to push the unease aside. She fetched water from the half-frozen barrel, split another log, and tried to settle into her routine. But the quiet she once welcomed now felt too sharp, too expectant. It reminded her of the night before her parents fell ill, a heaviness pressing against the air as if the world knew sorrow was on its way. The sun drifted lower, turning the snow into a sheet of soft gold. She stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching daylight thin like stretched fabric. She almost went inside again, almost, but a distant thud cracked through the stillness. Then another. Heavy. Measured. Too deliberate to belong to any animal she knew. The horses shrieked, rearing against their ropes. Her heartbeat jolted into a frantic rhythm. She squinted toward the ridge, and at first she saw only trees, slowly swallowed by dusk. But then the forest shifted, parted. 3 figures emerged from the shadows like giants carved out of the land itself. They moved with the quiet certainty of men who knew the wilderness intimately. Muscular, broad-shouldered, bare-chested despite the winter wind, their skin bronzed and unbothered by the cold. Long black hair fell over their backs, braided with beads that clicked softly as they descended the slope. They were Apaches, unmistakably. Powerful. Unhurried. A force of nature and human shape. Susan's breath snagged. She backed into the porch post instinctively, her legs trembling despite her effort to stand firm. For years she had imagined dangers lurking beyond the treeline, but nothing prepared her for the reality of what approached now. The first man walked with calm assurance. His eyes were dark, steady, shaped by storms he had already survived. The second man carried a fiercer presence, his jaw clenched, his stride heavier. The third lingered slightly behind them, his gaze softer, more thoughtful, as if he saw more than the other two did. None carried weapons she could see. None spoke. They simply stopped a stone's throw from her porch, the snow settling around their boots in quiet reverence. The world seemed to shrink down to the small space between them, a thin, trembling line of breath and frost. The tallest stepped forward. His voice was low, deep, shaped by the cadence of mountains. When he spoke, the words felt like part of the wind itself. "Pack your things and come with us." The world tilted. For a moment, her mind refused to process the meaning. She blinked, swallowed hard, tried to find her voice. When it came, it was soft, thin, barely more than a cracked whisper. "Why?" The second man, not the calm one but the fierce one, lifted his chin, his expression unyielding. "A storm is coming. A hard one. Strong enough to bury a cabin like this. You will not survive it alone." She shook her head slowly, clutching the porch rail to ground herself. "I've survived worse winters." The third man, quiet, observant, studied her with an unreadable expression. "Not this one," he murmured, his tone almost gentle. "This storm carries death on its back." She felt something inside her chest twist. Fear, yes, but also confusion, anger, disbelief. Who were they to command her? Who were they to assume she needed saving? Yet beneath her defiance, a sliver of truth flickered. The sky had looked strange all day. The wind had carried warnings. Even the animals sensed something. The calm man stepped closer. His presence was immense yet strangely steadying. His voice dropped softer, though no less firm. "We are not here to harm you. We are here because your life depends on leaving now." Her breath shook. She glanced at the cabin, the place she had guarded so fiercely, the only home left to her. Snow drifted from the roof like falling ash. She felt the weight of 3 years' press against her spine. The wind rose suddenly, sharp and cold, whipping through her hair. The horses wailed again, fighting their ropes. The calm man extended a hand, not touching, just offering, hovering near the cold air between them. "Come with us," he said, and the way he spoke made something ancient stir in her bones, something that recognized truth when everything else felt uncertain. But she didn't move. The world held still, suspended on a knife's edge. Snowflakes drifted between them like slow, drifting sparks. Then the quiet man behind him lifted his gaze. When his eyes met hers, something in his expression, something deep, unguarded, almost aching, told her that this moment would change everything she thought she knew about loneliness, danger, and the strange shapes that salvation sometimes wore. The wind howled once more across the valley, and the first heavy flakes of the oncoming storm began to fall. The storm thickened around the cabin like a living thing, curling its cold breath around the porch posts, as though urging Susan to decide quickly. The 3 men stood unmoving, their silhouettes carved against the pale dusk, their presence both impossible and undeniable. She held the porch rail with knuckles white as winter apples, her heartbeat loud in her ears, her breath rising in trembling wisps. The calm man, Taza, she later learned, watched her with an expression that held neither impatience nor threat. Only certainty, as if he were accustomed to people doubting him until the truth proved otherwise. When he spoke again, his tone carried the weight of something old and unavoidable. "The storm will bury your roof by nightfall. The winds will take the walls. If you stay, you die." The fiercer one, Nantan, stepped forward. His shoulders were broad, the muscles in his arms thick as braided rope. He scanned the cabin with a practiced eye, his jaw tight. "You have been lucky in past winters. This is not luck's season." Lucky. The word stung her, as though the years she survived alone were nothing but fortune's careless kindness. She straightened, narrowing her eyes. "I do not need rescuing. I've cared for myself since I was 19. I've lived through storms that killed whole herds." Nanton's brows drew together, his irritation rising like heat off a wildfire. "Pride keeps graves full," he muttered, but Taza lifted a hand and silenced him. It was the third man, the quiet one, who shifted the moment. He stood slightly behind his brothers, tall but softer in his stance, as if he had learned the art of observing before acting. His gaze met hers gently, steady enough to hold her breath captive. You fear losing what little you have left, he said softly. No shame in that. But a home that cannot keep you alive is not a home. It is a trap disguised by memory. The words landed with a weight she wasn't prepared for. She turned toward the cabin again. Its familiar windows were clouded with frost. The door leaned slightly from age. The shadows inside were long and lonely. It wasn't weakness that made her hesitate. It was grief. Leaving felt like losing her parents all over again. She swallowed hard. What do you want from me? Taza's answer came without pause. Nothing but your survival. But why? She whispered. Because this land is changing. Your cabin sits on ground our mother once protected. When we saw smoke rising here again after so many quiet seasons, we thought settlers had returned to take what little remained. But then we learned it was just you. A girl alone where girls are not meant to be alone. We watched through the past moons. Saw how you lived. Saw how the land did not swallow you. Nanton's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not interrupt. Taza continued, his voice a low hum against the wind. When the storm signs showed, we knew you wouldn't see spring if we left you. The revelation struck her with a strange mixture of shock and indignation. You watched me? The quiet man's brows lifted slightly, as if the question were softer than it sounded. The mountains teach us to know who walks upon them. You were not prey. You were, enduring. She didn't know what to do with that word. It lingered in the air between them like an untouched note on a violin string. The wind shrieked suddenly, flinging snow into her face. She stepped back instinctively, the cold slicing across her cheeks. Taza nodded as if the weather itself joined their argument. Pack only what you need. We leave now. Her breath caught. She looked again at the valley, at the heavy gray sky sinking closer by the minute. She remembered last year's blizzard. The night the roof beams cracked and she huddled beneath the table until dawn. That storm had been cruel. This one was different. The cold today had a sharper edge, as though the world itself were bracing for something dreadful. She turned back to the men. Their hair whipped in the wind, long black strands snapping like banners. They stood steady, unshaken, fused with the wilderness as though carved from stone and storm. She realized something then. These men feared nothing except perhaps losing time. Reluctantly, she nodded. Fine. But I pack myself. I don't need your hands on my things. Nantan smirked faintly, but Taza inclined his head in respect. As you wish. She pushed past them and entered the cabin. The familiar scent of pine sap and smoke hit her like a memory she wasn't ready to face. Her hands trembled as she folded the essentials: woolen shawl, spare dress, her father's knife, her mother's hair ribbon, a few jars of dried beans. Every object she touched seemed to whisper, "Don't leave me behind." But she forced herself to choose only what she could carry. Outside, the storm intensified. The horses stamped nervously, snorting plumes of white. The men worked quickly, fastening straps, adjusting saddles. Their movements were precise, practiced. They had done this many times before. She stepped out with her small bundle. Taza took it gently, surprising her by waiting for her nod before securing it to a horse. That quiet courtesy unsettled her more than any order could have. You ride, he said. The path grows steep. I can walk, she replied. He met her gaze calmly. The mountain does not care about stubbornness. Before she could argue, the quiet man stepped forward. Koana. His voice was low, warm despite the cold. Let him help. There is no shame in letting others share your weight. She stiffened, but something in his tone softened her resistance. She allowed Taza to help her mount. They set off as the first true gusts of the blizzard swept across the valley, snow swirling in frantic spirals. The world blurred into gray and white as they entered the forest trail. The wind bit at her face, but the horse moved steadily beneath her, guided by Taza's firm hand on the reins. Branches groaned under thickening frost. Ice crackled. The storm roared louder, swallowing the sound of their footsteps. Yet amidst the chaos, she felt something unexpected. A faint thread of safety, thin but unmistakable, weaving its way through her fear. Koana walked beside her horse, his steps soundless in the snow. Occasionally he looked up, checking her posture, her hands, the tension in her jaw. He said nothing, yet she felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. When the trail narrowed and wind tunneled through the ravine, he moved closer, shielding her with his body. She didn't thank him. She couldn't. Gratitude meant accepting she needed them. But in her chest, something shifted. As the darkness deepened and snow swallowed the last trace of her cabin behind them, she realized this journey was no longer just about survival. Something far more complicated, far more dangerous, was beginning to stir between them, something that threatened to change every truth she had learned in her years of solitude. And the storm had only just begun. The climb into the mountains felt like stepping into another world, a place where winter ruled with quiet authority, and every breath carried the taste of snow-dusted pine. The trail narrowed until the trees pressed close on both sides, their branches bending under the weight of the storm. Susan clung to the saddle horn, her fingers numb despite the wool wrapped around them. The horse beneath her moved with patient endurance, its body heat rising in faint clouds, its hoofbeats muffled by fresh snow. The storm no longer howled like an angry spirit. It settled into a low murmur, the kind that seeped under her skin and whispered that night was coming fast. Taza led the way, his broad back cutting a path through the wind. Nantan followed close behind, his watchful eyes scanning every shadow, every shifting branch. Koana walked beside her again, his presence quieter than the storm, but somehow more grounding. He checked her posture now and then, never with words, only with a look that softened the trembling at the edges of her breath. Time blurred into the gray-blue hush of winter dusk. When Susan's legs began to shake from cold and fear, Taza finally lifted a hand and pointed toward a cluster of dark shapes ahead. Not trees. Not rocks. Buildings. Old, weathered, leaning slightly as though bowing to the weight of forgotten years. A trading post, Koana murmured, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. Abandoned long ago. We've kept it standing. The promise of shelter sent a thin ribbon of relief through her. The structures rose like ghosts in the snow, their walls patched with rough planks, their roofs strengthened by hand-cut beams. Smoke drifted faintly from the chimney of the largest cabin, carrying the scent of juniper and pine pitch. She let herself breathe in that warmth long before they reached the door. Inside, the air was thick with heat and shadow. Firelight flickered across fur blankets, carved tools, and bundles of dried herbs tied along the rafters. The place held a strange mixture of wilderness and home, worn by years but cared for with quiet devotion. Susan shivered as the warmth wrapped around her, melting the ice clinging to her hair. Taza set her bundle near the hearth without touching anything inside, a courtesy she noticed more than expected. "Sit," he said gently. "Warm yourself." She hesitated, unsure whether sitting meant surrendering. But her bones ached, and the fire called to her like an old friend. She sank onto a fur-covered bench, letting heat seep through her layers. Her breath steadied. Her heart did not. Nantan moved past her toward the door, brushing snow from his shoulders. He shot her a look, sharp, evaluating. She stiffened instinctively, though she didn't know why he unsettled her more than the storm itself. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her cabin earlier, as if measuring its weakness. Or the way his voice cut like winter wind. Koana crouched near the fire, stirring a pot that simmered with fragrant steam. He added something, juniper berries perhaps, then ladled broth into a wooden bowl. When he handed it to her, he did so with both hands, palms open in a respectful gesture. She accepted it carefully. "Thank you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. His gaze lifted. In the firelight, something warm flickered in his eyes, an ember that surprised her, a depth she had not expected. "You've traveled far today," he said softly. "Rest. The storm will keep us inside for a while." The broth warmed her throat instantly, filling her with a gentle heat that softened the tightness around her ribs. She watched the flames curl around the logs, their glow reflecting in the room's shadows. She expected silence, uneasy, heavy, but instead, the space held a strange, tentative calm, like the quiet breath before a snowflake lands. Taza settled on a low stool near the wall, his posture relaxed but alert. Nantan stood near the window slit, arms crossed, watching the swirling night as if expecting it to bite. Koana sat on the floor beside the hearth, tending the fire with the patience of someone who understood its personality. Susan set the empty bowl aside. For a moment, she let herself speak into the warm air, her voice careful but steady. I didn't think I'd leave my cabin. Not ever. I thought I owed it to them to stay there. Taza's gaze softened. Your parents? She nodded. The land remembers them, Koana said quietly, surprising her. Nothing you do will erase that. Staying or leaving does not change the truth of who they were. The words slipped into her like warm water, easing a tight knot she hadn't known she carried. Nantan snorted faintly but didn't interrupt. The fire popped, casting sparks into the air. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls with muted roars, testing the shelter's strength. Susan drew her shawl closer, feeling the storm's weight as much within her as beyond the cabin. Taza leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You are safe now. But safety is only the first step. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? Before he could answer, a gust slammed against the shutter, rattling it violently. The entire frame shuddered. Nantan reacted instantly, crossing the room and bracing the wooden board with his shoulder. The storm grows angry, he muttered. Koana rose and checked the beams, his fingers brushing along the wood. They will hold, he said, though a faint crease formed between his brows. Taza looked at Susan again, his expression solemn. The mountains change people. Storms reveal truths. You will face both here. She felt a tremor run through her, the kind that wasn't from cold. What truths? Nantan shot a glance at her, his eyes dark as coal, guarded, suspicious. The truth of what you carry inside, he answered, his tone edged. And what you might bring upon us. Her stomach tightened. I didn't ask to come here. No, Nantan replied, turning back to the window. But you are here all the same. A weighty silence settled. The fire flickered, shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. Susan felt suddenly aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every unspoken thing lingering between them. Koana returned to the hearth and sat again, closer this time. His presence radiated a quiet steadiness, something she hadn't felt in years. You are not our enemy, he said softly. Not unless you choose to be. She swallowed, uncertain whether the words frightened her or comforted her. Outside, the wind rose in a long, mournful howl. Snow battered the shutters in relentless waves. The trading post groaned, but it held firm. The brothers exchanged a glance, silent communication built on blood and battles she knew nothing about. Taza stood and placed another log on the fire. Tonight, we stay awake in turns. This storm is the kind that tests more than walls. Susan wrapped her arms around herself. What does it test? Kohana's answer was barely above a whisper. What a person believes. And what they fear losing. The flames cast warm gold across his face, revealing an expression she could not fully read. Part concern, part something deeper, something almost tender. It made her breath hitch in a way she didn't understand. Nantan exhaled sharply, as if tired of the emotion weaving through the room. But even he didn't break the stillness that settled over them. Hours passed in a slow drift of firelight and muffled storm roars. The walls creaked. The wind moaned. She felt sleep tugging at her, but she fought it, unwilling to appear weak before men she barely knew. At some point, Koana rose and approached with a fur blanket. His steps were quiet, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He draped the blanket over her shoulders with careful hands, his fingers grazing her arm. The touch sent a ripple through her, soft but undeniable. Rest, he murmured. The storm will not end before dawn. She met his gaze, and in that brief moment, something shifted inside her. Something fragile yet fierce, something she hadn't felt since before the world broke beneath her. But before she could say anything, the wind outside rose with a raw, guttural roar, slamming against the walls so violently that dust rained down from the rafters. Nantan swore under his breath. Taza reached for the support beam. Koana turned toward the door, jaw tightening. Something had struck the outer wall, something heavy. And not from the wind. Something heavy slammed against the wall again, making the beams tremble, as if the storm itself had grown fists. Susan jolted upright, her breath snagging as a cascade of dust drifted down from the rafters. Taza grabbed a lantern, its flame flickering wildly in the sudden draft, while Nantan shoved his shoulder against the door as if holding back an unseen brute. Koana moved to the window slit, eyes narrowing as he tried to pierce the blizzard's white fury. Another impact. A deep thud followed by the groan of wood straining under pressure. Susan's pulse thundered. Her thoughts leapt to beasts she'd heard howling across winter valleys, the kind that hunted in packs when the moon hid behind heavy clouds. But the sound carried a different weight, deliberate and singular. Not claws. Not teeth. Something else. Taza shouted over the wind's roar. Brace the north beam. The snow's sliding from the ridge above. Nantan cursed under his breath. He shoved away from the door, grabbed a thick branch used as reinforcement, and jammed it under the sagging roofline. The structure quivered again, as if deciding whether to hold or collapse. Koana turned, voice low and urgent. It's not just the storm. The ridge ice is breaking. The mountains are shedding their weight. Susan rose despite her trembling legs. The room spun for a moment before steadying. She moved toward the central support beam, her instincts guiding her before fear could stop her. Taza thrust another brace toward her. Hold it here. Press your shoulder into it. Do not let it slip. She obeyed, her strength surprising even herself. The beam was rough beneath her palms, heavy with age and resin. She pressed into it, her body trembling with effort as the storm hurled its weight against the trading post again. Nantan and Koana worked in synchronized silence, reinforcing the roof from opposite ends. Taza surveyed every angle, barking instructions when boards shifted or threatened to give. The fire snapped wildly, sending sparks skittering across the floor. Wind howled through unseen cracks, carrying the icy scent of pine and the metallic tang of snow. Another violent crash echoed through the shelter. Susan gasped as the beam shuddered against her. Fear clawed at her throat, but she held firm. Her voice came out raw. How much more can this place take? Taza answered without looking at her. As much as the people inside decide it must. She didn't know if he meant it literally or as something larger, but the words sank into her like a struck bell. Minutes stretched, each one feeling like a trial of endurance. The storm battered them relentlessly, a primal force challenging their resolve. The roof creaked dangerously. A plank split near the corner with a crack sharp as a whip. Snow poured through a widening gap until Nantan shoved a hide against it and hammered it into place with his fist. Susan's arms burned. Sweat mingled with cold along her spine. Her breath came in desperate bursts. And then, suddenly, the tremors eased. The wind softened its assault, shifting from fury to exhausted moan. The shelter settled, its beams groaning like old bones relieved of pressure. Koana lowered his brace slowly. The worst is past. Susan let out a shuddering breath, though her muscles still trembled. She stepped back from the beam, her legs unsteady. Taza steadied her with a hand on her arm, not gripping, just anchoring her gently. You did well, he murmured. She swallowed hard. I only held a beam. Koana turned toward her, his gaze steady and strangely warm. Not everyone stands when the world tries to push them down. Nantan scoffed softly, though something begrudging flickered in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, though he'd never admit it. He stood near the window slit again, peering into the storm. The wind still carried thick sheets of snow, but its rage had broken. The night breathed easier. Susan moved toward the hearth, staring into the fire, as if it could explain what had just happened to her heartbeat. In the reflection of the flames, she saw not fear but something else, strength she hadn't known she still possessed. Taza sat beside her, rubbing frost from his hands. The mountains test all who seek shelter within them. Tonight, you proved you don't break easily. She looked at him, surprised by the softness in his tone. I've had years of practice in not breaking. Koana took a seat across from her, his eyes following the tremble still lingering in her shoulders. Solitude teaches one kind of strength, he said. But standing with others, that's a different trial. Harder. Braver. The room quieted. The storm outside hissed softly, as if listening. Nantan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He studied Susan with a seriousness that made her shift uneasily. You've survived much, he said, his voice low, But survival carries its own weight. People who live alone too long sometimes drag danger with them without knowing. Susan stiffened. What danger? Nantan tilted his head slightly. The kind born from ghosts of the past. The kind that makes choices clouded by fear. You may not mean harm, but fear can be as sharp as a knife. Her breath faltered. I didn't bring danger here. Taza glanced at his brother sharply. Enough. But Koana shook his head gently. No, let her speak. She deserves truth, as we all do. Susan swallowed. I didn't want any of this. I didn't choose for the storm to come. I didn't ask for you three to drag me from my home. Kohana's expression softened. We didn't drag you. We offered you life when the storm would have taken it. Nantan muttered something in Apache under his breath, too low for her to understand but sharp in tone. Koana shot him a look that carried quiet warning. Taza rested his forearms on his knees, leaning forward. There is more you should know, Susan. More about why we came for you. Her chest tightened. About the land? Taza nodded slowly. Yes. Our mother protected that valley long ago. It is sacred, though not just to us. The storm is not the only threat rising in these mountains. Others have begun moving through the passes. Men who hunt for claims, for timber, for anything they can take. Your cabin sits on the path they seek. She felt a sting behind her ribs. So you didn't come because of me. You came because of the land. Kohana's gaze lowered for a moment, then met hers again with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. We came because we didn't want the land, or you, to fall into the wrong hands. The fire popped sharply, sending an ember skittering across the floor. Susan flinched. Nantan stepped on it before it touched the hides. Silence draped the room again, thicker than before. Then Koana spoke, voice softer than the flames. There is something else. The storm wasn't the only reason we feared for you. Susan's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Koana held her gaze, steady as winter stone. Because someone else knows you're alone in that cabin. Susan's breath froze in her chest. Someone had been watching her. Outside, the wind moaned through the dark like a warning carried through snow. The storm faded into a tired whisper by dawn, leaving the trading post wrapped in pale blue stillness. Snow lay heavy across the roof, but the walls remained standing, stubborn as the people who had held them through the night. Susan stepped outside into the fragile morning, her breath lifting into the cold like a quiet prayer. The mountains glowed with the first shimmer of sunrise, a soft gold tracing their jagged edges. She felt the chill sink into her bones, but beneath it pulsed something steadier, an anchor forming where fear had once lived. Taza and Nantan scanned the tree line with silent precision, their footprints dark against the bright snow. Koana lingered near her, watching the horizon with narrowed eyes, as if listening for a sound the wind had swallowed. The truth he revealed hours before still clung to her like a shadow. Someone else had been watching her cabin. Someone unknown. Someone whose presence in these mountains carried danger hotter than fire. A sudden crack broke through the quiet, sharp as a snapped branch. Nantan's hand flew to his knife. Taza motioned for silence. The forest stilled, holding its breath. Then movement rippled through the pines. Slow, deliberate, wrong. A lone wolf emerged, its ribs sharp beneath winter fur, its eyes fixed on the four of them with a hunger that had nothing to do with meat. The creature stepped forward, ears flattened, muscles coiled. It was desperate, driven by the same storm that had nearly crushed them. Taza raised his arm, but Koana moved first, placing himself between Susan and the threat with a fierce, instinctive protectiveness that sent heat rushing to her face. She reached for him without thinking, fingers brushing his sleeve. "Don't," she breathed. But the wolf lunged. Snow exploded beneath its paws as Nantan hurled a stone, striking it square in the shoulder. The beast yelped, skidding in the snow, then bolted into the trees, disappearing as swiftly as it came. Silence returned, brittle and trembling. Susan's knees nearly buckled. Koana turned to her, chest rising fast, eyes burning with something raw and unguarded. "You could have been hurt." His voice cracked around the words, as if they cost him more than fear. She shook her head. "You put yourself in front of me. Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. The confession hung between them like a flame refusing to die. Her breath hitched. His did too. The world, for a moment, narrowed to the space where their hands touched, his rough and warm, hers trembling. "You don't even know me," she whispered. Koanna stepped closer, snow crunching softly beneath his feet. "I know how you survive storms. I know how you stand when the world tries to break you. I know you carry loneliness like a scar you never asked for. And I know," he paused, voice trembling, "I know you feel this too." Her heart opened like a thawing river, painful and unstoppable. She nodded once, unable to speak. His arms came around her, steady and certain, pulling her against the warmth she'd long denied herself. Behind them, Taza exhaled softly, as if releasing a burden he'd held for too long. Even Nanton's expression shifted. Less suspicion, more understanding. The rising sun spilled gold across the snow, lighting the mountains in quiet blessing. And as Susan leaned into Koanna, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, she understood that winter had not brought her an ending. It had brought her a beginning.